the Sackler Colloquia on the Science of Science Communication, where scientists and communication professionals come together to write a better future for communicating science.
We have now our second, I think, will be a second extraordinary session. Just before we start, some people have asked how to communicate with us, and as mentioned, we really want people who are here and out in the hustings to be able to communicate with us. So if you look at page 24 of the program, and I assume there's an equivalent for those who are joining us online, it has instructions for how to share with the hashtag Sackler, and there's various other communications, and we will have our roving microphones after this talk. So the next talk from will be from Susan Fiske. In a way, follows naturally from the discussion that we had earlier, where you have different ways of looking at the world, different opinions. Science is, and at least fashions itself as being privileged in some ways, and we know that there are some ideas that win out in the battle of ideals, perhaps warrantedly, perhaps unwarrantedly. So this is a long-time study of exciting research in social and cognitive social psychology that Susan Fiske, a major contributor to that area, will discuss. Susan is a professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton University. Her two commenters will be Craig Fox, who's a professor of psychology and medicine, faculty member and School of Management at UCLA, and Bill Hallman, who's professor and chair of the Department of Human Ecology at Rutgers University. So let me invite the panel up.
So, I'm coming to talk to you as a scientist who studies social cognition, how people make sense of other people, and the topic for today is how our audiences make sense of us and how our audiences' motivations as human beings affect how they hear us and how they see us as scientists. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to start by talking about public beliefs and emotions, or affect, as we say, and make the point that communicator credibility needs both of these things to be in mind. And I'll argue that as scientists, we have the respect of our audiences, but we don't have the trust. And then there is some preliminary data I'll mention. This is not just opinion. And then close with a focus on trust. So the case study I'm going to use is people's responses to climate change communication. This is not my primary area of research, but it seemed important to take a particular form of science communication seriously. And when you look at this, there's good news and bad news. The scientists and the public, sorry to use that term, but scientist is a big category too, are more and more polarized. And one of the interesting findings that we came across was that people's attention to science and ecological news versus political news polarizes their risk perceptions and policy support. That is, climate change is a very politicized topic, and the more you pay attention to politics in the news, the more divergent you are from people who pay attention to science in the news. There is obviously, this is an area where there's clear scientific consensus about the patterns and the role of human beings in these patterns. But there's public ambivalence as compared to the scientific lack of ambiguity. And over time, there's actually become much more naysaying and skepticism, which is not the direction that most scientists would have liked to have seen. But at the same time, people are worried, and they associate climate change with kind of alarmist imagery. So something is getting through, but maybe not necessarily what was hoped for. So the question is how to reconcile the scientific and the public perspectives on things. And I think the first place we have to start is understanding that people are not idiots. As scientists, we tend to think that we know everything and they know nothing, and that's really not a good stance to take. This is not just about ignorance. The public now knows a lot more about climate change and its potential causes, and the public can distinguish science from non-science. They have different models of science, and we have to understand that when we're trying to communicate with them. Some people have a sort of classical, there's a single true answer model of how science works, but other people have a more Kuhnian view that there are multiple answers to negotiate and debate, and they're more accepting of scientific uncertainty if they have that point of view. My point is that the people that we're communicating to have different views of science. They're not just one lump in their way of thinking about our sciences. So what I would like to say, and this is my main point, is that it's not just about their knowledge. Not that we don't need to keep communicating as we learn things, cutting-edge things, and as consensus emerges. But another side of attitudes is the emotional side, the affective side. So there's decades and decades of research on attitudes and persuasion in social psychology, and attitudes are related both to cognitions, that is beliefs, and affect, that is emotions. Together, these beliefs and emotions make up motivation, and these inform people's attitudes toward everything. There is a press for consistency between people's emotional reactions and their cognitive reactions, and persuasion works the best when it takes account of the mix and sometimes the lopsidedness of a particular type of attitude, which might be more emotional or more cognitive in nature. So there's clear evidence from other people's work that both affect and values do motivate people's cognitions about climate, and we best pay attention to that. So what's the role in communication? There's also decades of research on communicator credibility in social psychology. There are two components to it. One is expertise, knowledge and ability to be accurate. And the effect that this has in general in the literature is that if somebody is seen as an expert on their topic, then other people are either automatically cued to agree with them, this person knows the answers, they must be right, or if you're motivated to go beyond the sheer expertise, then people respect the message enough to scrutinize it and think about it. But there's something else, which is trust. Communicators are ineffective if they're not trusted. And the trust is about the perceived motivation of the communicator to be truthful. If people trust the communicator's motivation to be truthful and accurate, then that's an automatic cue to validity of the persuasive communication that people are giving. So it requires not only expertise, but trustworthiness. And this is a neglected side in our analyses, I think, of our communication across science, non-science boundaries. And one question is, so who are audiences trusting? There's an asterisk here, which I can come back to in the discussion if you like. One topic is that people trust persistent minorities, but we'll come back to that. What's more relevant and more general is that people trust people they think are like themselves. This is human nature. People trust people who they think share their values, share their goals, and they're motivated to support these people. This is a really core insight within social and behavioral science. These core motives really matter. So the motive to belong to a group and to be part of a group and to trust that group is really wired into human beings from the moment we're born. Other people are our environmental niche, really. And your group setting and who you belong to matters more than whether you're in the savannah or the jungle. From belonging comes a motivation toward shared understanding with the other people around you, and Doug Madine's talk, I think, illustrates this, that there's shared reality among people within a group, a particular angle on how to see things. Another motivation that follows from this belonging orientation is a sense of control. That is, what I do has an impact on what happens to me. So both of these are more sort of cognitive implications of the belonging motive. There are a couple of more affective implications of the belonging motive. One is enhancing the self, feeling good about yourself. Doesn't mean you have to think you're the greatest, but people have to feel pretty good, to get out of bed in the morning. So there's a motive to feel at least good enough or improvable. So if you insult your audience, for example, you've lost them. And then the one I'm focusing on here is trusting other people. There's pretty good evidence that people are, all else being equal, motivated to trust people, especially in-group members, but in general to expect at a baseline that the other person will communicate with them in a truthful way and be trustworthy. So these are the more affective implications of people's core motivations as audience members or as human beings. So how do people identify whom to trust? And in particular, they look for people who they think are like them or share their values. That defines your group. They have shared goals and values with you. So I'm going to tell you about a framework that we've developed for how people understand the sort of cultural, social landscape of groups. The first question people ask, and this is arguably a highly adaptive one, is this other person or this group on my side or not on my side? If you're walking down a dark alley at night and somebody's coming toward you, you have to know what their intentions are. Do they have good intentions toward you or bad intentions toward you? The same with new groups of immigrants coming to our country. Do they have good intentions toward us or bad ones? Do they share our values? Do they not share our values? If they are on your side, then they're seen as warm and trustworthy. The other dimension you need to know is whether they can act on their intentions. And so the cross-cutting dimension of this is competence, perceived competence to act on their intentions. Because if they can't act on their intentions, they don't matter to you that much. Okay, so this is a two-dimensional space, warmth by competence, which turns out to explain everything. Well, okay, a lot. So let me give you an example from outside the science communication area. This will give you a sense of how people think. So if you take the warmth dimension is going this way and the competence dimension is going the other way, for Americans, Christians, middle class, white people, blue-collar people, men and women, are seen as central, high on warmth and trustworthiness, high on competence. At the opposite end, you have poor people who are seen as not being trustworthy and not being competent. And I have to tell you, sadly, that this is true all over the world. Poor people are seen in this way as not having any redeeming features. Children and old people, in particular, are also seen all over the world as being well-intentioned but not very competent. Sorry. This is becoming more relevant to me, so I'm studying ageism too. And then groups that are seen as having a lot of competence but not good intentions include rich people all over the world. So they're seen as cold but competent, okay? And then in different countries, what you see is different groups, ethnic groups and religious groups, slot into these different parts of the space depending on the particular cultural history of the place. Anyway, my point is that this is, it's a useful framework for thinking about how groups relate to each other. It's not just us versus them. There's more nuances. Oh, and part of the point of this is that these emotion words that I've stuck into the corners of the space are directed at those corners of the space more than to the others. Now, that means that people feel pride about the middle class, they feel disgust about most poor people, they feel pity toward old people, and they feel envy toward rich people. This will have implications for us in a minute. Okay, so I'm using the term universal advisedly, but this is a reliable set of findings across US samples, across countries. We're now up to more than 30 different countries where we've tested this in their own framework for their own groups. It's true over time, it's not a recent invention, and it's true over subtypes. I don't have time to go into all this. It's actually also true for other intent-having targets, that is, animals and corporations. I won't go there, but it's pretty interesting. Okay, so what about science communicators? My point is that I'm using this framework to help us think harder about how we are seen and therefore how we have to work to communicate the things that we care about. So what we did, we gathered a little pilot data, we polled online and asked people about what are typical American jobs. We selected the most common jobs that were mentioned, and some of these included scientists, researchers, and professors, people like us. Then we polled a new sample about these jobs, and we asked them, this is crucial, how does American society view these people? And we asked them about warmth dimensions and competence dimensions, and also emotional reactions, and then we apply cluster analysis to it, and we get a picture. Okay, so here's the deal. You may notice that researchers and scientists are in the cluster of more competent but cold. And you know, we're not as bad as lawyers. What can I say? You know, if you think about yourself as a professor or a teacher, that's better. In fact, teachers really pretty darn good, right up there with the most admired groups. You know, down here, we're not either like prostitutes or dishwashers or truck drivers. So my point is that there is a tendency to view scientists and researchers as competent but cold. And cold means not trustworthy. So we also asked them about the emotions that people feel toward these groups, and our cluster elicited more envy than other groups. This is a dangerous emotion. Envy is not good. It says, you have things that I respect and I'd like to have, and I'd like to take them away from you. So let me give you an example about how cold competence is resented. This is from our other work. What we've done is assemble pictures for the different parts of the space that people recognize, and then manipulate various things about it. But what I want to focus on is the cold, competent people who are not us, but are in the same part of the space. So rich people and entrepreneurs and business people. So some of my evidence for the fact that the cold, competent folks are resented is that people report for envied groups feeling not so great when good things happen to them. And they don't feel so bad when bad things happen to them. So if you know the word schadenfreude, this is elements of schadenfreude, which is kind of malicious glee at somebody else's misfortune. And moreover, beyond these reports, we put EMGs on people's smile muscles, and we got something very interesting, which is when we told people about these different groups from different quadrants of the space, and we said there are everyday good events and bad events happening to them, they smiled, zygomaticus major, they smiled more for the good events than the bad events, for everybody except the envied group. So when a guy in an Armani suit, gets splashed by a taxi cab or sits in gum on a park bench, people smile, they can't help it. Okay? But guess what? We're in that quadrant. So think about that. That's not good. Okay, so if you go back to this, when scientists get their comeuppance, people are not entirely sorry about that. And that's a little worrying. So what we have to do in our communication, I think, is show worthy intentions. We have to work on the warmth dimension, which is all about why are you doing this and what is your intention in doing this. We've got the competence. We have to not worry about that. People do respect us and believe that we have the knowledge. That's not the issue. And our intentions are not necessarily trusted. People are profoundly intent detectors. People detect what they think are other people's intent within milliseconds of seeing their face. So you're not going to remove this tendency that people have. So what do people think climate scientists' agendas are? How does this intent detection system work? We did a little pilot study on this too. There was a certain amount of distrust, believing that people might lie with statistics or complicate a simple story or show that they're superior, or trying to get research money, or pursuing a liberal agenda, or provoking people for its own sake, or hurting big corporations. These are some of the motivations that at least some of our audience thinks we have. And particularly money is a problem. So of these items that all load together in the measure, thinking that people are just trying to get research funds when they argue about climate science, that's really our Achilles heel. You know, it's not all bad news. There's a fair amount of trust as a baseline, so that's encouraging. There's an orthogonal dimension of educating the public, saving humanity, saving the environment. That's all good, and those are all things I think to emphasize, to put to rest a little bit some of the concerns about that we're just in it for ourselves or in it for some nefarious agenda. And so clearly this is our better approach. And you remember when I was showing you the cluster analysis, teachers and professors are respected more than pure researchers and scientists because of the teaching aspect of what we do. That part people both respect and trust. So the public in general trusts impartiality, not a persuasive agenda. It's one thing to say, here's the science about this, and it's another thing to say, and you have to recycle everything. I mean, you know, those are different. And people, you have to think about sort of what the communication is, and if you're respecting your audience, you need to give them a chance to separate out the scientific communication from the policy implications of it. And frequently we end up, because we're passionate about what we do, we end up stressing the persuasion part, but people don't trust that as much, and maybe deliberation is better. You know, there's this we could do, or that we could do, or the other thing we could do. There are various things we could do. What do you think we could do? And communicating uncertainty is part of this, to the extent that there is uncertainty in the science that's being communicated. But, you know, coming back to the theme, trust is the one thing that best predicts people's attention to scientific experts. So what I've said is that in talking about the public, we have to not only take their beliefs and cognitions into account, but also their emotions and their values. And their, in particular, communicator credibility needs both expertise and trustworthiness. I presented a little data to say, you know, maybe we have the respect, not the trust, and that trust matters. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I also very much enjoyed Susan's presentation, but probably because I find her both competent and warm. What I'd like to do is highlight a few things I think that are very important that she said and riff on them a little bit. I think it's really important that she emphasizes the fact that social context matters in science communication. We too often ignore that, and we focus on the content of the message, maybe the way it's framed, but not so much the interaction between the public as intent detectors and the scientists themselves, who are the sources of the message. Secondly, she stresses the importance of affect and values in influencing our beliefs, sometimes in unconscious ways. And third, I think this point that she makes about the acceptance among the public of scientific uncertainty, this Kuhnian view becoming more prominent, I think is very interesting, especially to myself as a behavioral decisions theorist who studies uncertainty. What I'd like to develop in the next 7 minutes are a few points. Really, that this kind of point of view that Susan is advancing contributes to the polarization that we see in a lot of scientific discourse. There's an unconscious allure of in-group positions, and in a polarized political environment, that tends to drive people's perceptions apart. It further gets supported by an illusion that we understand scientific principles better than we actually do. And finally, even when there is considerable consensus on the scientific topic, like climate change, the minority views tend to get psychologically overweighted. Let me unpack each of these. As for the unconscious allure of in-group positions, I'll share with you an experiment I ran with Michael Morris and Erica Carranza some years ago, where we presented people, we asked them what their political affiliation was. Who did you support, identify in the last election? Which of these candidates did you support? And we asked them to make risky choices between different chance gambles or between different investment portfolios. that were ranged from conservative to risk tolerant. The manipulation was a simple one. We either, it was just an order manipulation. We either asked the political questions first, in which case we thought that their political identity would be activated when they came to the risky choice. And either that or we asked them about the economic choice first, in which case they wouldn't be activated. And we found a striking effect. In the control condition, where there was no identity activated, Bush Republicans and Kerry Democrats tended to choose the low-risk option with relatively equal frequencies. However, when you activate that identity, I'm a Bush Republican or I'm a Kerry Democrat, they were driven very far apart. The Bush Republicans now overwhelmingly were attracted to the conservative option, even though it wasn't conservative in a political sense, and the Kerry Democrats went in the opposite direction. This replicated when we used real chance gambles with real money at stake. Distressingly, when the labels were reversed, so that, for instance, the stock-heavy portfolio was labeled as conservative, the effect reversed, so that now the Bush Republicans like that option better. Even when you hold their feet to the fire and ask them, in what sense is the conservative option conservative, they had no trouble coming up with an explanation why it was conservative, and it didn't remove the effect. Secondly, I'll say that extreme views, once they take hold, tend to be supported by an illusion of understanding. Cognitive psychologists Risenblit and Kyle know this, that the public tends to be overconfident how well they understand how everyday objects work. For instance, think about how well you understand how a toilet works or a ballpoint pen. When you ask people this, they give themselves a fairly reasonably high level of understanding until you hold their feet to the fire and ask them to actually draw it out and explain it mechanistically. Once you do that, people start to realize, oh yeah, these things are a little more complicated, and they subsequently attenuate their rated understanding. We wondered if the same thing could happen in a context of rating policies. For instance, last year when the Supreme Court upheld most of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, more than 3/4 of Americans in a Pew poll expressed a perspective on whether they supported or opposed it. However, barely half of them could correctly identify what exactly that decision was. So we presented a number of individuals in an online sample with several policy issues, for instance, cap and trade, policy to curtail carbon emissions, or a national flat tax. We had them rate their positions, and then we had them rate their level of understanding, and then attempt to explain their position in one of two ways. Either, what are your reasons for believing what you believe, or holding their feet to the fire in a deeper way, asking them to explain the causes and effects, for instance, how cap and trade influences subsequent carbon emissions. And then we had them re-rate their understandings and their positions, and here's what happened. In the reason explanation condition, people had no problem explaining their reasons, and it didn't affect their point of view, the extremity of their view, right? I believe what I believe because I believe it. However, when we held their feet to the fire and asked them to come up with a more mechanistic causal explanation of how the policy works, in this case, people were much more moderate in their perspective in terms of how much in favor or opposed they were to the policy, and they rated their understanding as lower. Moreover, it also affected their willingness to contribute to advocacy causes. They were less willing to contribute, and the extremists especially. So we wondered, is there also a similar phenomenon, the illusion of scientific understanding? And the short answer is yes. When we presented people with various scientific principles like carbon emissions from human activity cause climate change, or nuclear energy is good for the environment, and did exactly the same kind of a manipulation, we found the same result. That is that when people are asked to make causal explanations about how carbon emissions affect climate change, it actually reduced their subsequent rated understanding, and it moderated their positions. When we just asked them for reasons why you believe what you believe, it had no effect. Distressingly, there was a side effect of puncturing that illusion of understanding, however, because when we asked people whose illusion of understanding had been punctured how interested they were in learning more or funding more research on these topics, it led to less support for further research. So that's something that we need to look at. This is data we just collected last week, so maybe next time I'm here I can tell you more about that. The last thing I want to say is that even in situations where there's considerable consensus like climate change, and there will be a new report on the international consensus on climate change later this week, I believe, we know from decision theory that low probability events tend to get overweighted when we make decisions. And I think, based on some research we've been doing recently, and this is partly based on an attentional process. If, for instance, I'm told that 10% of scientists believe X, I interpret that as, okay, X could be true or false. I kind of anchor on equal credence in the proposition being true and false, and I adjust insufficiently downward in this case for the fact that it's a view that's only held by 10% of scientists. And we wondered, well, if you unpack that, can you lead to a more even-handed weighting of those perspectives, as we've seen in some decision-making studies that we've done? So we presented subjects with a number of scientific causes. For instance, this one has to do with a hypothetical bird that might be facing possible extinction due to habitat encroachment. And we said, we surveyed 10 environmental scientists about what they believed. 90% said yes, the species will become extinct if nothing is done. 10% said no. When you present it that way, in this description-based way, we thought that people would sort of overweight that low proportion. They wouldn't be very sensitive, in fact, to the proportion of people who thought it was true versus false. But now imagine that it's unpacked, and you're led through it one at a time. Yes, one says. Yes, another says. Yes, another says. Yes, another says. Yes, another says. No, one says. Yes, yes, yes. When you do it like that, it forces people to allocate their attention in a way that's proportional to the probabilities with which those views are held. And we thought people would be more sensitive to differences in probabilities with which people thought the event was true. When we did this, you can see here, we actually used 20% versus 80% in this example. You can see that support for protecting the habitat was modestly sensitive to the probability. That is the proportion of scientists who thought there really was an extinction threat. When we unpacked it in the way that I showed you, they were much more sensitive. So if you think about the way the media reports on science principles, they always want to tell both sides, which is responsible journalism. However, it may accentuate this bias towards giving undue credence to the remote views. We replicated this effect with a number of other different scientific principles where people were more sensitive to the proportion or the frequency, relative frequency with which those views were held when it was unpacked compared to when it was packed. So just in sum, I think that a lot of what Susan has said really speaks very directly to this polarization of scientific views in this climate, this unconscious allure of in-group positions that tends to be supported by an illusion of understanding and is resistance to extinction because of this overweighting of the marginal views. So thank you very much for your attention.
I think I have one intro slide to show. So thanks very much. I've been looking forward to having this opportunity to talk with you and to echo many of the great points that Drs. Fox and Fiske have made. So I want to echo a couple of things. One is this issue of communicator credibility. And I think it is really clear that, that expertise and trust are extraordinarily important. It is pretty clear that people are increasingly focused on the motivations of science and scientists. And I think we've actually entered into a kind of a new age of science cynicism, where people are increasingly asking these questions about why we're doing the things that we're doing. In fact, one of the things that my colleagues and I did to prepare to write a grant to the NSF, which I will note was not funded in their infinite wisdom, was on animal cloning and public perceptions of animal cloning. And so we had open-ended interviews, and we asked about 30 people what they thought of animal cloning. And at the end of the interviews, we finished up with, and so what else would you like to know about animal cloning? So here's a thought experiment. What's the thing that you would most want to know about animal cloning? Well, here's what our lay audience said. Number one, and this is the order and the total number of hits. Number one, who is doing it? Number two, where are they doing it? Meaning in the United States, in New Jersey, in China, in a third world country. And that sort of gets to the trust. Are they our scientists or are they those scientists? Why are they doing it? So what are the goals and objectives of this? I'm sorry, AV guys, can you actually give me my time? Otherwise, I will go way over. Thank you. What's the status of the research? So how far are they into this? What are the risks and benefits? And interestingly, the risks and benefits to consumers, but also to the animals involved. Then they asked, who is monitoring all of this? Who's regulating it? Is it safe? Are the animals normal when they're cloned? And then, how does it work? What happened to Dolly? Interestingly. Will we eat the food from cloned animals, and is it safe? Now, the point I want to make is, what's the very first question on this card? Who's doing it? What is the third to the last question? How do they do it? And yet, as science communicators, pretty much out of the box, one of the first things we want to explain is how we do it. That's not the first question people have. Ultimately, they will get to that. But if we cannot answer these first questions, they're not going to sit still for the answer to the 10th question. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We also have to understand that when we talk about science, the plausibility of what it is we're saying and how it actually fits. Great. So I'm almost half out of time. Fabulous. So how what it is that we say fits with people's personal experience matters, and we know that people create their mental models based on whatever plausible information they have available to them. We have to understand what those mental models are, and we have to learn to speak in ways that connect with what people think they already know. We also have to realize that many of the things that we talk about as scientists are indeed invisible. I do work on public perceptions of risks related to biotechnology and DNA, to nanotechnology. I do work around climate change. I do work around food safety risks. All of these things are invisible to the naked eye. And so people have to trust us because they can't see these things themselves. And again, this is where these mental models come in. They have mental models of these invisible things. I was reminded, I had a chance to, as part of a nanotech initiative, go to Los Alamos. And they have a very impressive set of machines designed to manipulate and measure nanotechnologies, nanoparticles. And millions and millions have been spent on these machines, and I took the tour, and I couldn't help but think, you know, I can't actually see anything in any of these instruments. This might very well be the most expensive flea circus ever created. This issue of warmth, I think, is also critically important. There is really good data that suggests that a mismatch between cold competence and warmth actually exacerbates the mistrust of the person who is coldly competent. So you need to be both competent and warmth. So we need to help scientists develop greater social and emotional intelligence, if that's possible. And what I mean by that is we need, as part of our science education, to teach people how to tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. To tell a joke that's actually funny. And to take a joke when it's warranted. Okay? And as my students will say, there's nothing worse than a full professor who believes he's funny. So what we're talking about here is a kind of bedside manner. You know, in addition to being coldly competent, we need people to be able to relate to other folks. The thing is that we can judge expertise and competence from the standard CVs that we all put out there. Measuring social competence, measuring emotional abilities, just is not there on the CV. Now, there may be hints to it, you know, teaching awards, community service, these kinds of things I think are important. I think that this stereotype, we need to work against the stereotype that people have of science and of scientists being sort of coldly competent and not being able to relate to one another, to normal folks. You know, we see this on television, I won't name the shows, but also cartoons. We portray people as, you know, as mad scientists and so. But the more troubling thing is what I'm seeing in the political sphere, where politicians are beginning to denigrate science and scientists. And I hate to bring him up, but he is a rather large presence in politics right now. So Susan and I are from the great state of New Jersey. Our governor, Governor Christie, in a speech last month to the Republican National Committee said, and I quote, "I think we have some folks who believe our job is to be college professors. College professors are fine, I guess. Being a college professor is, well, they basically spout ideas, but nobody ever does anything about them." Now, it's possible he's talking about the idea that there is a human impact on climate change. but I don't think that's actually what he meant. Okay? And I object to this not primarily because of the implicit denigration of college professors, but if you actually look at the slide that Susan showed where professors are and where politicians are, what I object to is him dragging us into the same cluster as any leader of any political party. The other thing about Susan's slide showing those particular clusters is I learned, so I was in one of those clusters. I was a dishwasher. I worked in food service. And I think that I learned more in that sphere, in that realm, working in those jobs, than I ever learned in graduate school in psychology. And if I had a wish, it would be that as we select people for honors theses and to go on to graduate school, that we ask them what kinds of jobs they've had, whether they have had experience in that realm. I think every student should have a service job. Every science student should have a service job. They should work in food service. They should be a dishwasher. They should ride public transportation. They will learn more than they ever will in graduate school. So I am out of time. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to give Susan a chance to respond, and I think we'll start the questioning here in the audience. So put up your hands, and we have our two people with mics, and they'll spot you. So, Susan.
Well, I really appreciate the comments, and part of what excuse me, part of what Craig's comments remind me of is I'm not saying that there's no knowledge issue here. There definitely is, a knowledge issue and people, thinking they know more than they do. I just want to raise the bar for what we think they do know and say it's not that they know nothing, but then how you get people to, interrogate their own level of knowledge and unpack it and so on, I think is extremely important. And I also really appreciate, your comments about warming up the scientists, and the idea that, if you can talk to people about relatable things and tell stories, but also, the service that we do, Obama came to the NAS this past year and spoke, and he said, I want to thank you all for volunteering, and it's a good thing you're volunteering because we have no money. But I think that part of the point of, the whole point of the NAS is science in service of the nation. And I think to the extent that people understand that we're not just trying to get research grants, that we're trying to be of service to the nation and provide advice and, and then stand back and let other people make the policy. I think that's, a really important way of framing what we do. It's another form of service.
Thank you. Let's take a first comment, question.
We don't have the comparative data over time about perceptions of scientists, and I haven't looked to see what there is existing in the literature. But I think we're clearly in a more politically polarized environment than we have been for some time, and there's lots of data indicating that. There's an interesting window on the minds of people who distrust us for political reasons in the discussion of the legislation to introduce a science laureate or science laureates. So we have poet laureate, right, whose job is to say poetry is cool, it's part of our national heritage. And the idea was to have science laureates who would say science is cool and, you can be a scientist and it's an important part of our heritage. And the political discourse around this, it wasn't even voted on. It was kept from the floor of Congress. It wasn't voted on because it was seen as having a political agenda, that somehow science laureates would have the pulpit to talk about values instead of just about science, and that somehow they would be seen as credible for arguing on behalf of certain kinds of legislation. And I think that's really too bad, you know. The short answer is I don't know how far back this goes, but it's certainly bad now.
Craig or Bill, do you have some follow-up? Or no? Okay. We have a question over here. Thank you.
Yeah, I was fascinated to see that teaching was better than research. Yet all the incentives in higher education are driving us to research, not to teaching. So how do we go about changing that to move us back up into a place on that graph where we'd probably be more comfortable?
Well, a number of years ago, I looked at the literature on the correlation between teaching skill and research skill, and it turns out that they're uncorrelated. But it's not negative. People have a baseline theory that it's negative, right? So it turns out that if you're a productive scientist, you get marks for being, you know, cutting edge, being enthusiastic, really knowing what's going on. You get lower marks for being available to students and things along those lines. So, you know, I think it would behoove us to think about that. You know, I think the incentive structure in American universities is not going to change anytime soon. But you know, one of the things that always sobers me up when I'm tempted to not spend time on my teaching preps is these are the future leaders of the country, you know. And if you teach in a big state school, which I did at one point too, I thought these are the future middle managers of my state, you know. And it's really important that they understand the kinds of things that I want them to understand. So realizing that you have a mission to educate the future, I think, is part of it. But, you know, it's not going to change the pay incentives, you know, because the university needs the overhead.
So here's a first tweet. Are there scenarios where cold competence is publicly valued?
Well, entrepreneurs are valued, but it's an ambivalent response because there's this envy thing going on, you know, so in our other research, what we find is that envied groups, people cooperate with them when they're sort of obliged to, because envied groups have resources, they have stuff. You know, as scientists, we know stuff. And so when things are stable, it's fine. But when there's instability, these groups also get attacked, and frequently genocides are directed at groups in this part of the space, just saying, you know. And so this deep ambivalence, you know, has a sort of dangerous side to it. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, yes, there's respect that comes with it, and it is publicly valued on that dimension. It's just the other dimension is problematic.
I think I would argue that in certain kinds of personal interactions, cold competence may in fact be valued. I care more if I'm going into surgery that my surgeon is quite skilled than that he can tell the joke.
Yeah.
I have another tweet. Even how speakers dress is interesting. Business formal implies expertise. Does it imply warmth?
Okay, so if any of my students are watching, I actually do own a suit. See? I think that the issue is that there are certain kinds of stereotypes of professors, of researchers, of scientists. And sometimes it makes sense to work with those stereotypes. I have a jacket, I have a tweed jacket with patches on the elbows that I will occasionally bring out when it makes sense to play with that stereotype or according to type. In lots of other cases, it makes sense to work against type, and I think this is, well, at least I decided this was one of those.
Let's see. Here, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Very interesting discourse. And in terms of your comment about people with real-life work experience, now I'm going to put my label on myself. This is not a good idea. I'm a physician researcher in public health, and I agree with you. If I had my way, everyone would go do 2 years of Teach for America or something.
Hold the microphone closer to your face.
Is that better?
Yes, ma'am.
Too much. Okay. But my other question has to do with the interesting concept of the Kuhnian discourse. And I find more often that people are like, tell me the bottom line. I hate stuff in health, they'll say, where there's one answer today and there's another answer tomorrow. What is truth? And I don't know how to reconcile that with the concept of recursive discourse.
I didn't fully hear. Go ahead.
Well, this is really not my expertise, but I think that respecting your audience as, smarter than one might think. So you can say, the odds are this and this. If it were my mother, I would do this. I think trying to convey the information, respecting people enough to convey the information in again, in a teaching way, rather than just look how much I know, but in a teaching way, say, and also, I didn't talk about this, but people have different needs for information. Some people want a lot of information and they want to grapple with it and think about it, and most scientists are like that. But other people, don't have a big need for grappling and thinking and ruminating about stuff. And so, in a service setting, I would want to find out. So, like, how much do you want to know? And, so, but in a larger group setting, I think respecting your audience and then saying, here's this and here's that. And if you want to make a policy conclusion, you say, okay, now I'm taking off my scientist hat and I'm telling you what I personally think. And now I'm putting my scientist hat back on, And so I think clarifying your own motivations is really, a lot of it.
I guess what I would add is just that one of the things I was trying to get across is when we try and be responsible in talking about science topics and the uncertainty that is there in the science, which I think is absolutely appropriate. And when journalists take seriously their responsibility to tell both sides of a story, it can distort the degree of certitude that's held in the scientific community, as we see with climate change, for instance. And it's worse than that, because even if you come up with some number, like the scientific community is 95% sure that climate change is real and man-made, people don't have a real sense for what 95% means. They tend to be very undersensitive to probabilities. We've seen that probability creep up in recent years quite a bit, but the public beliefs haven't shifted that much. And I think the reason is because we're undersensitive to differences in probabilities. And so we need to think more creatively about ways to communicate it. If you hear a story on NPR, for instance, about some scientific topic like climate change, usually you hear one point of view that's played up, and then they work hard to get the other point of view. If equal airtime or even close to equal airtime is given even to the marginal view, then it's going to have exaggerated impact on the public's credence. And so we need to think creatively about ways to sort of visually or otherwise communicate those relative proportions in a way that people can absorb.
I just want to add a footnote to that. I really agree, and the approach that you're taking, is very cognitive in nature,
yes.
And it makes total sense, to say yes, 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 no, yes, because then people can unpack it. In addition to that, I would suggest that we think about people's attributions about why the holdout is saying what the holdout is saying. Because what you find, and this was the asterisk in one of my slides, is that people think that persistent minorities are credible because they are minorities and they persist. That is, you must really believe what you think if you're standing up against everybody else. It's like the holdout in a jury. That person has to be really motivated to resist all the other people on the jury. And so over time, what happens in groups is that a resistant minority gains more and more credibility because they don't cave in. They must really believe what they're saying. Now, whether what they're saying is true or not is another question, but people...
Especially to the extent that they're seen as competent and warm. But even think about when you read through Amazon reviews. I remember having this experience when I read the reviews early on for Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And of course, they were overwhelmingly positive. But when you're forced to scroll through how much people liked it, and then you see that marginal one who says it's a terrible book, you start to... It's actually easier to, in a static context like that, I think, to marginalize that marginal view in a way that you just don't get from that summary evaluation of how many people gave it 5 stars versus 1 star. You know, you could imagine having some registry of top climate scientists and forcing people to kind of read through that one sentence review of what they think of the science. I think that they'd be left with a very different impression than when you get some statistical number.
My teaching ratings are like that. It's always the one or two negative ones.
Burke, let me throw in one comment related to this, which is, so I work in the area of food risk. And often we want to be as perceived as competent and to sort of know what's going on immediately, and sometimes we're wrong about that. It turns out not to be the cucumbers, it turns out to be, you know, the spinach or the bean sprouts. And there's a cost for claiming that you know what's going on and then shown to be wrong. And the work that my colleagues and I are doing right now suggests that a better strategy for scientists and policymakers is to say, this is what we know now, and we're fairly confident about that, but here's what we're doing to reduce the uncertainty. And when you do that and you turn out to be wrong, people are a lot more forgiving than if you say that you think you know what's going on in the first place.
We have a question up in the mezzanine.
So I create programs in which researchers, scientists, and engineers interact with the public. So they educate the public about their research, also programs in which they talk to K-12 students, K-12 teachers, the whole gamut. And the volunteers are more and more each year. But given what I'm hearing today, do you have advice to these scientists and engineers and researchers and to people like me who create these programs, how we can up the warmth quotient when we have these programs, these direct interactions with the people?
Well, it occurs to me, I mean, thinking of yourself as an educator is important, and that's, I think, the bottom line. But it also occurs to me that talking about why you went into the science is not a bad idea, because it says, here's my motivation, right? And so in the last panel, we heard it would be a good idea to increase the diversity of scientists. And, you know, because who you are informs what you think is interesting and how you go about studying it and the conclusions you draw and how you analyze your data and so on. And
Siri's going to answer the rest of the question.
But so I think that for scientists to tell a little story about, you know, how I got interested in this and why I do what I do, then there's not a blank where the motivations go, right? You've filled in the motivation, the intent. And as an example, part of the reason that I went into scientific psychology was because I looked around when I was in college and thinking about graduate school, and I realized that there were a lot of conclusions being drawn that I thought female persons would not have drawn. You know, there were two ends to a scale. It was clearly one end that was going to be, in general, more women than men, and the other end was going to be more men than women. And the people interpreting what it meant were all guys. And I thought, well, that could be true, but there could be other perspectives on it. And so part of the reason I went into the field was to, you know, to bring some other points of view to the scientific marketplace. You know, I realized that I had to have the methods training, or otherwise I wouldn't be taken seriously. And I wasn't coming out, you know, to support a particular perspective, but just like there should be a variety of perspectives, and then they can all, you know, compete and see what ends up seeming to be true. But so I think it's important for, you know, any kind of scientist who wants to connect with people to think of themselves as an educator, but also to make clear what their motivations are.
I would actually go beyond that and ask the communicators to try to imagine themselves in the seats of their audience, at the age of their audience, and remember what it was like to be 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever age, and perhaps tell a story about what they remember about that age and what got them interested in science, so that, you know, if we're talking about kids, so that they can actually see that you were a kid once too, and that, you know, you didn't spring fully as a scientist, to try to, you know, to kind of make that connection. I find that too often, and this sort of relates to the earlier question about credibility, that whenever scientists open their mouths, they're trying to impress other scientists. It is a barrier to talking with the media, for example, because many of us are afraid that we're going to say something and one of our colleagues will read it in the newspaper and say, well, that's not exactly right. But we need to learn to talk in stories and metaphors and analogies that connect with what our audiences already know.
It's also true on the cognitive side that if a message is imparted in a way that is easy to process, metacognitively fluent, then it's judged to be more likely to be true.
Right.
So we sometimes undermine our own credibility by overcomplicating things in the way in which we try and get things across.
And on this issue of complication, one of the things that Susan talked about in her presentation is we do have this tendency to overcomplicate. I think because we want to impress each other. I had the great opportunity to be a visiting scientist at the research, at the Forschungszentrum Jülich in Germany, and as part of the process of working there, I had to be interviewed by one of the staff members to get a work permit. And this is a place that has several thousand scientists, many visiting scientists. And so she sat down and said, okay, so what's your name? When were you born? Where's your PhD from? And then she said, what do you do? And I said, I study public perceptions of risk and risk communication. And she said, and? I said, isn't that enough? That's a full-time job. And she started laughing. And I said, what's so funny? She said, you're the first person in 17 years who could describe what they did in 9 words. So one of the things that we need to do is to help each other explain what we do fairly simply. The most dangerous thing you can ask a scientist and at any kind of social gathering is, what do you do? Because they will tell you in excruciating detail. So we need to learn to help each other tell our students to tell their stories, simply in an interesting way.
Here's another question from away. We've presented research on how people view the public, how they think that other people view the public. How true are those views? In terms of how much of science is motivated by striving for research funds, the scientist's ego, etc. Does this vary across disciplines? E.g., this may be diagnostic, sociologists versus physicists.
Probably more than we would like to admit. We know that we are given to a lot of the same biases that we study. We know that a lot of us are given to confirmatory biases, for instance. We tend to be more critical of disconfirming than confirming evidence, and we constantly have to be on guard about that. I think that we're getting, in social and behavioral sciences, more and more sensitive to those biases and better at safeguarding against them, and we probably still have some more work to do.
I would also say that, in a way, it doesn't matter if they're true. What matters is this is in the minds of our audiences, and so they're going to act as if it's true. So, I study stereotypes, and I don't go how true are they. It doesn't actually matter from my point of view, because what matters to the interaction is this perception.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my question is for Susan. I'm interested in the warmth versus competence data, what the gender breakup was, both in terms of the job allocations as well as the respondents.
Well, the sample is, roughly 50-50 male-female. One of the things we find in this research on perceptions of social groups and even the perceptions of jobs is it doesn't matter what your own group is, because everybody can report what American society thinks, or the couple dozen other places we've been. Everybody knows it's a cultural thing that people share about, what different groups are supposedly like in the public image. That being said, there are comparable dimensions in gender research. Communion and agency is the name they go by. And there are comparable dimensions in leadership research, going by various names depending on whose theory you happen to be subscribing to. And so, these dimensions, the warmth and competence dimensions, cross-cut a lot of domains. And it was kind of reassuring to us to realize that we had reinvented the wheel, because that meant that we weren't just making it up. But so I I wouldn't completely reduce it to the gender kinds of dimensions, but I think there's something related, certainly.
There was another one. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was wondering if Dr. Hallman could tell us what he learned washing dishes that scientists need to know.
I learned a great deal about human behavior, both from what came back on the plates and frankly, how the dishwasher was treated by the chef and by the waiters and waitresses who were making 9 times as much money as I was. That's what I learned. I also learned to be on time. I learned that without me, the entire restaurant would grind to a halt. And occasionally did when I was not treated particularly well. But I was also a waiter, and I learned a great deal about human behavior with that as well, about people's, what people needed, and anticipating what they wanted, and anticipating their questions, and knowing sort of who was going to pay the bill at the table, because that was the person that you wanted to sell an extra drink to. So it's very applied psychology. Those are the kinds of things I learned. And that people need to feel important, and your job is to make them feel important at the table. I learned a great deal in those kinds of service jobs. I recommend them to every student. No job, no experience is wasted if you're actually thinking about it at the time.
So I want to just elaborate on that a little bit. Most of my work is in intergroup relations, and we have 50 years of research suggesting that there are a couple ingredients that make intergroup contact work well, and one of them is equal status in the situation. Now, you weren't, changing your status from dishwasher to chef, but it was clear that they needed you in that situation. And having shared goals, having the restaurant work well, is also a key ingredient to intergroup contact working well. So if you change this to scientists and public, equalizing the status in the situation would be a good idea, in the situation, and also having shared goals and taking them seriously.
One purpose of communicating science is to convince others to believe what the consequences of their actions may be, especially in public policy. Yet you say that what's more convincing, and I agree, are stories, especially simple stories. How does a scientist reconcile the need to convey through anecdote versus evidence with its attendant uncertainty?
I don't think it's a versus. I think you're raising a really important point. You can't just stand up in front of people and tell a bunch of stories if you're trying to be a scientist. But I think that, the stories connect to people and also supply your motivations, because otherwise they're guessing what your motivations are and using stereotypes to do that. And then you have the credibility to talk about what you came to talk about. As far as the third part of what you were saying is, convince people of the consequences. I think, again, a combination of evidence and stories, if we do this, then this will happen. If we do that, then this other thing will happen. And telling stories that make it real and concrete. One of the key ingredients of persuasive communication is not just to make people scared.
Right.
You have to provide them with a solution, right? So if you just make them afraid, then they'll avoid the topic because they can't handle it anyway, so why should they think about it? So I think
it also depends on your audience. I suppose scientists talking to scientists feel a little bit freer to talk in jargon and talk in details and nuance, because it's easier for other scientists to process that jargon and nuance, and they're hungry for it, and they're asking those more skeptical questions. But when speaking to a more of a lay audience, I think that stories are more successful. And in fact, a lot of science can be communicated in stories. I find myself in my teaching, I tell stories about experiments. Social psychology is especially good for that. And so students start to identify with it and remember it more than if you just describe it in dry academic terms. I'll also say that people's sympathy is driven more by stories than statistics, and there's been work in behavioral decision theory on that. Your willingness to give to a cause, for instance, is going to be stronger if you hear a story about one poor orphan, for instance, than if you hear a bunch of statistics, or even if you hear the story supplemented with the statistics. So.
And I think, Bill Hallman's point that, his students said nothing worse than a full professor telling jokes and thinking they're funny. I mean, you don't want to betray who you are as,
Exactly.
a purveyor of information. I think one of the problems that we have is that they think we're trying to control them, right? So we're trying to tell them what to do. And, I don't think we have the right to do that. We have the right to describe information and talk about consequences in the most consumable way we can, but not to be in charge of all the policy, much as we would like to be.
Right.
We have chance for one very short question and a very short response.
I'm not sure that the answer would be short. My question is, do we know where scientists working for the government fit in the warmth competence chart? And if we don't have that, can you speculate on how the public perceive communications coming out from government?
We have time for a yes or no answer.
Well, if you mix where politicians are and where scientists are, it's not a good result.
Public health scientists.
So my question was going to be to the psychologist, how has it affected our cognitive and affective processing to have Abraham Lincoln in our peripheral vision all morning? So,
it's good.
Well, let me thank the panel.